Hello, everyone. This is Rosemary Coates in Silicon Valley. I'm your host for this edition of the Frictionless Supply Chain Podcast. I'm the executive director of the Reshoring Institute, where we help companies bring back or expand their manufacturing in the US. And I'm a contributing writer to Supply Chain Management Review. Today, I'm delighted to introduce you to Lisa Dender, the global lead for product chemical regulations at IBM, and also a dear old friend of mine from 30 years ago when we worked together at Hewlett Packard. So we've known each other for a long time. She has a long history of working in supply chain management. She's an engineer and a Stanford grad, but I'm going to let her tell you some more about her background in just a minute. Today, we're going to focus on chemicals in the products and supply chains that we deal with every day and why we need to be concerned now. So let's get started. Welcome, Lisa.
Hi, Rosemary. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up working in this part of manufacturing?
So I started my journey as a mechanical engineering student at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And as part of that program, I went to work in robotics with IBM. When I graduated, Hewlett Packard took me to San Jose to work on their warehousing, logistics, and distribution. So that's how I got introduced into supply chain back when we called it manufacturing. While I was there, I earned my way into a resident fellowship with Stanford. And I got to tell you, the year at Stanford was something else. I can't even tell you how transformative it was. But while I was there, I got to learn a little bit more about passion projects and new ways of thinking. And so from there, I was able to pivot when I got back to HP to get into the environmental space. And some of your viewers may know about RoHS, the reduction of hazardous substances. That's removing lead from solder. I got to work on that project. And then I switched back to my original company, IBM, which is where I am now. And I continue that journey. And what's interesting is that I don't do RoHS anymore. I do its sister regulations called REACH, and it's not just for the EU, it's global. So I work on almost all chemicals except lead and solder as an example. And that's what's gotten me started in this position. And additionally, while I was here, I got to do something with INAMI. I got to co-lead two different projects to define repair and recycle metrics for the industry as part of the circular economy. And that really lit a fire under me for circular economy, which, we've talked about a number of times.
So let's start with the definition of the circular economy, in case anybody doesn't know what it is or is a little unclear about it. What is it and how does it affect supply chain?
So if you'll indulge me, I'm going to actually read the definition because it has a number of facets in it, and it ends up being very important because this is part of the EU. So just indulge me so that I can get this part right. So the EU defines the circular economy as a model of production and consumption, which involves sharing, leasing, reusing, repairing, refurbishing, and recycling existing materials and products for as long as possible. So it's pretty simple and elegant, overarching definition. And its objective is to reduce waste. This is all started with, in Europe, they don't have all the landfill space that we might have in the US. It's just a different way of looking at things. And they're very intent on reducing waste, squeezing it all the way out, which, by the way, I'm kind of into as well.
Okay. Yeah, I know that in many instances, the EU is far ahead of us in terms of the green technology overall and recycling efforts and so forth. Yeah. So a few weeks ago, I interviewed Callie Egren from Ascent. She was my guest, and she talked about forever chemicals known as PFAS. And can you remind us what forever chemicals are and how you deal with them in supply chains?
So, by the way, I loved your interview with her. The forever chemicals are the moniker that people are using right now for a class called PFAS, PFAS, which stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. Now then, I'm not a chemist, I am a supply chain professional and I'm a mechanical engineer, and I get tripped up with the really long names. But in the periodic table, for those nerds out there that like me, it's the halogenated stuff. So it's fluorine, it's bromine, I think iodine, but it's rarely used in industry the way we see it. But there's something special about that column in the periodic chart. Matched with carbon, it creates this really powerful, strong bond, and it creates a class of chemicals of which there's, like, I've heard anywhere from 5,000 to 9,000 substances out there. Your audience and me will recognize Teflon. We Teflon coated pans. And then others would recognize maybe Scotchgard, I believe might be the brand name for it, but it's the stuff that's used to make stains, your coffee stains or pet stains on your furniture or on your clothes and things like that. Well, those chemicals have been used so pervasively, and a long time ago, they were believed to be inert, that they were strong and powerful, but they didn't cause any harm to the planet, to the earth, the air, the water, the human body, any of that. And what's starting to come in now is a horrifying realization that at very low levels, they probably are inert, but they're cumulative. And it takes a long time to see the cumulative effect. And this just really breaks my heart, but it's showing up in
if you use Teflon pans every day, over time, there's a buildup of this chemical. Is that right?
There's potential for that. There's a potential for the buildup just in the soil from all of the products that have been used. You've got Teflon tape in plumbing. All of us, I have, you try to get a better seal for your water lines and stuff. You wrap some Teflon tape on it. You've just got all these little micro doses of all these sources of this particular chemical. Now, and I'm not a specialist in this, but there also, I've seen news articles where it's been used in fire suppression systems and foam. So the electronics world is not really the contributor to putting PFAS into the environment, where it's showing up in water. And, I've heard it's at the polar caps. I've heard it's at the bottom of the ocean. I've heard it's in breast milk and blood and organs and tissues. And now then, unfortunately, the cumulative effect, my guess, I'm not the expert, but my guess is it's coming from water. And my guess it's coming from fluid introduction, like foam suppression, stuff like that. Scotchgard, taking a shower, washing clothes that have Scotchgard or something on it. Now, I'm not an expert in that, but that's primarily my guess where it's coming from, and that's why it's spreading, because it's in water. Well, water's everywhere. It's even in rainwater. And so from a standpoint of people and the environment, we're now becoming very, very concerned, because there are some scientific indications that the effects of the buildup of this substance in any one person or animal has some toxic effects. And again, I'm not the expert specifically on those, but you can think in terms of cancer, immunosuppressants, autoimmune diseases, things like that. And basically, the new evidence is turning people on their ears. They're getting really frightened, and I believe probably rightfully so, that we need to be taking this very seriously.
So there are new regulations, I guess, that are aimed at these PFAS chemicals in products, and that's what's so worrisome, because they're in so many industrial products. And now, if you're a manufacturer or an industrial buyer, you got to be concerned about whether or not these are chemicals that are in the products you're buying or making, right? And that's going to have sort of a cast a big shadow on global supply chains.
Yes.
Trying to find this stuff, right?
Yes.
And replace it if the new regulations ban these products.
Well, and I believe it's when we've already seen in the U.S., the state of Maine, and your audience can Google it. But the state of Maine has already taken very significant action. I get asked all the time, why Maine? Why are they leading? I don't have a perfect answer for you, but they're very proud of their wide open spaces, their water, their environment, their, back to nature kind of stuff. And I think that they maybe became even more alarmed than the rest of us, and they don't want their world polluted, from industrial uses of this chemical coming into their space. So Maine, the state of Minnesota, is two U.S. examples. The U.S. EPA is taking on PFAS through their TSCA Act, Toxic Substances Control Act. And so they're going to start requiring reporting of PFAS. But the one that we really have to pay attention to is back to the regulation that I live in, REACH, the REACH regulation. Right now, the EU Commission is very aggressively trying to ban the use of PFAS globally or across the board. And when I say globally, that means inside the EU or the EEU, the countries that agree to participate in the REACH regulations. Well, that's a huge market for any global company. The European market is enough to tell things. We got rid of lead and solder because of that. So right now, they are drafting and requesting comments on regulation to ban PFAS, to literally say that's it. And so the opportunity is right now to communicate any uses in the supply chain that cannot be dealt with in any other way, communicate with the EU so that they can create what is called derogations, exemptions. So what the EU tends to do is say, well, you can't use it in baby bottles, or you can't use it in carpet. But if it's semiconductor, you can use it until 20XX, and then you have to get rid of it. And that they are usually pretty reasonable if you give them technical information as to why it has to be used and how it can continue safely.
If you're a buyer in a manufacturing company and you're using suppliers across the globe, in China, for example, or Vietnam or Bangladesh, how do you determine whether there's PFAS in these products, or how do you deal with it? I mean, even in the EU, they have buyers that are sourcing a lot from China, and
Right.
if China doesn't have the same regulations, how do you determine this, or what do you do about it?
Well, in IBM, and then there was something similar in HP, and then I have colleagues at Apple and others. So in the electronics industry, most of us have a specification for the environment that is built into our contracts, where we say you can't use these substances. Asbestos, for example. We don't deal in DDT, but if we were dealing with pesticide, your contracts, when your purchase contracts, you specify up front, thou shalt not. And then the other ones are reportable. And for smaller companies, let's say that you don't have all of those big infrastructure, the lawyers, the specs and stuff like that, you have to ask. You have to educate yourself enough, and you have to ask. We know asbestos is bad. We're talking about PFAS now. You could use PFAS as the starting point to have that conversation. Say, supplier, I don't want PFAS. Are you using it? And then you have to give the supplier time to answer, because the supply chains can hop 1, 2, 3, 4 steps back.
Right,
I
right.
mean,
Many
personally,
years,
I
yeah.
think the better way to do it is to require the companies that generate the chemical to tell everybody, give a disclosure sheet that must follow it throughout the process. And I think that's been tried a number of different ways, and it usually gets defeated. But what Europe has control over is the ability to sell a product in a country. So Europe is taking the stance that, you want to sell your product in the country, you figure out what's in it. And once enough people are pushing and saying, I'm not going to use that, it's got a nasty chemical in it, then the market for that drops, and the company providing the service or the product has to deliver a solution.
Yeah, so if all these countries are starting to introduce regulations like this, and there's movement in the industrial buying community for asking these questions about PFAS and where is it, and is it in the products and so forth. I would say that would raise the awareness in every single country about the use of these chemicals. So are there any kind of global standards, or is each country or each region on its own for figuring this out?
It's a hybrid approach. So I'd have to think of it at the top of the pyramid. So we do have the UN, and it was a great question. You gave me a heads up and said, I'm curious about this. And I went and I looked because I usually live in the mid zone where I see the regulation. I've been working with the regulation, and I just do my thing. But the UN does have some efforts that they lead to bring everybody together. But keep in mind that the UN and the government agencies and all of that are, the way I like to look at them is the population saying what they want. And then you've got the industrial complex who are saying, here's what you can have. And now then there's this tension between the two. So one that I run into is a convention, which is called the Stockholm Convention on POP, persistent organic pollutants. So this is a treaty that was signed by a number of countries, and they all agreed that they would implement a POP regulation. This is over 10 years, maybe 12, 15 years old. And there's certain substances in there that are specifically banned. I think DDT is on that list. I don't deal in pesticides, so I'd have to go and look just to be sure. So one avenue that they could follow is to put the chemical on this persistent organic pollutant list, but then it still takes time for each country to promulgate and adopt that convention or that regulation. So
why are these chemicals so widely used? And if they're used in production all around the world, there must be some reason why everybody was using them in the past.
Yeah, they're great chemicals. I mean, what makes them good makes them bad. If we're talking about PFAS, but in chemicals in general, let's say that a semiconductor needs to wash the triazine stuff off of a board that went through the wave solder. Well, if you're building a wave solder, you've got this board going through, and you've got to have specific adhesion of the different components on the traces. So they have to wash it real clean, and then they have to get rid of the chemicals afterwards, because that could lead to tin whiskering or other things. It could lead to failures if you leave little bits of dirt and extra stuff on the board. So the chemicals that clean, the chemicals that slick, the chemicals that keep the solder soft and not popping, all these things. I know these are scientific terms, but these chemicals that are being used, they have a reason. They were created for a reason. There was a need in society for that chemical. And, I'm not anti-progress. The best example is in medical care, it used to be blood and all the saline stuff were in these bottles. And the bottles were nice and hygienic and stuff, but they broke, they were heavy, they were hard to transport. And then, can you imagine a truck having a bump and then you break all this blood? Now then we've got chemicals in bags, and it's more hygienic and it helps us move forward. So it's basically, you're given and you're taken away. There's a consequence. If you've got a chemical that comes in, you really need to understand what else it's doing. You got chemicals in dry cleaning, right? We've been doing dry cleaning for hundreds of years now, and those chemicals end up in weird places. So it's a very complicated problem statement to solve.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, there's a lot of new things to consider for sure in procurement and in manufacturing and logistics. Are there some basic principles that we should follow? I mean, should we try to, pick products with the least onerous materials, or what do we do? I mean, I feel like there's a heavy regulation component to this, but not sure what we do about it.
So this is a great concept, and it's one of those, because when you're standing there at the bottom of this heap of trash, I was going to say mountain, okay, but let's make it a heap of trash, and what's done has been done, right? And we need to keep going forward, and we can do better. But you're standing there and you're going, I'm so little and that is so big. How am I going to affect change? And there's a number of different ways. So this is the idea of some of the things to think about, and to all of your procurement professionals out there, every single solitary one of you can play a role. You just have to ask. Start the ball rolling. You can start the ball rolling by asking your supplier. You can ask your manager. You can ask your company owner. You can say, what is our position on PFAS? I don't like this. I don't like this idea. I want to know and be proactive. You ask your supplier, we're using PFAS as an example, but are you using PFAS in this product that you're selling me? Let's say that you want to buy a power supply, and you've got a choice about 10 or 12 different power supplies. Ask each of the vendors that offers you a power supply. And by the way, this is not saying that there's PFAS in the power supply. I'm just using that as an example, but that's an example. I need a power supply. Which one am I going to buy? Ask. And when you get the information, then use that information to inform which one you're going to buy. Because when you spend the money, it turns on the faucet for the one that's doing what you want, and it turns off the faucet of revenue for the one that's doing what you don't want. And that principle applies everywhere. And in the EU, what the EU is so excited about right now, because they've got this eco design coming and sustainable product initiative. And if anybody really wants to get excited about the next wave, either frightened or happy, just excited in general, they are going to make it so that companies have to tell you in advance exactly what's in the product so the consumer can make that choice. You can say, I don't want that electronic box because you didn't get rid of the bad stuff. And this company, it may cost me a little bit more, but this matters to me.
Yeah, a really interesting principle that there's both the industrial side as well as the consumers have to be aware of this stuff and avoid buying it or supporting companies that produce products with it. So, I think this begs the question in a lot of industrial buying settings. The buyers are bonused or they get incentivized based on cost savings, not necessarily on whether or not there's bad chemicals in a product. So I think we really need to also take it a step up and address these kind of issues at the executive level, where the
Yes.
executive says, your incentive is on cost savings, Mr. Buyer or Ms. Buyer.
Right.
However, we also want to avoid the use of these bad chemicals. So we're going to add an additional incentive for you where you eliminate, these forever chemicals out of the products that you're buying. So it's sort of it's at the ground level, the execution level is something we need to be aware of, but we also need to engage with the executives in the company to make sure we're incentivizing the right things. This is the same situation we come across a lot in the Reshoring Institute, where buyers are saying, we'd like to buy everything in the U.S., but it's too expensive, and my bonus is based on how much savings I create. So,
That's right.
it's a misalignment of goals that needs to be addressed before we can really make a difference, I think.
Well, and this is where the regulations come in. So I've been in industry my entire life. Okay. I admire the EU and what they're doing because they don't see it as a competition between the regulations and industry. They see it more as a cooperation, and they're creating these roadmaps and these plans. But keep in mind that government is you and me telling the world what we are going to accept and what we aren't going to accept. And sometimes you have to level the playing field with a regulation. And I know in some situations you'll say regulations are strangling, the economy, or strangling this. And I don't get into that. What I know is that if you can't, if there's not enough places saying no to PFAS, I'm going to use that as an example, then the behavior will continue and the unintended consequences will continue. But if a major market says no, absolutely, now then you've got the C-suite saying, uh-oh, my ability to sell is now going to terminate at 2020, 30, 2025. I won't be able to sell these products. And what I do, my job is to be this wild 3D control tower where I have regulations and customer demand, and I have long lasting supply chains, right? That I have to guess what the due date is, and I have to push those due dates all the way back deep in the supply chain to the original supplier. But each one of the buyers is playing a role. Each one of the procurement professionals is playing a role. And in my opinion, if you're a little bit voicey, you get up there and you'll say, listen, here's a threat to your ability, CEO, to sell your products in at least one, if not two, major markets. We know that Maine is probably not a major market, but it's the introduction of the concept into the US, which is a major market. And if we all pull together with that, then the businesses that embrace the idea go first and make the money first. Those that delay get cut out of the market, which is the same principle in business, right?
Yeah, and we know that on the executive level, there are companies that track the different words and things that are said at board levels, and they track how many times the word reshoring comes up in conversations, and sustainability. So those dual tracks are on just about everyone's agenda: sustainability and reshoring. They sort of go together, and they're on all executives' agendas practically in the US. I think there was a study that 89% of CEOs said yes, they were considering reshoring or sustainability in some way. Um, and so those two, are married together, because when you shorten the supply chain through reshoring or nearshoring, you address sustainability issues because you have a less of a carbon footprint. So those
Okay.
two things go together: alignment of the goals, looking for a coordinated view from the executive level all the way down to the execution level. Really important these days. You can't really do one or carry out one without the other. You have to have the executive direction, and the will to move in a certain direction, as well as the implementation of those policies in the ranks of a company. So yeah, a lot of things to consider, not only just about the chemicals themselves, but about how you operate within your company. There are a lot of career supply chain professionals listening to us today. As a leader with a long and successful career like you've had, Lisa, what advice would you give to people, particularly women, who are wanting to advance in their careers? What good advice do you have for us?
So this is one of my favorite topics. And the reason is that I didn't have you to help me when I was starting out. I would have gotten here faster and with more intention had I had a little bit of insight. Again, you're starting at the beginning of this long road and you can't imagine how you fit. What I ask the students that I mentor, two fundamental questions. So you sit with yourself very quietly, patiently, don't be afraid of the world, and you say, what problem do you want to solve in the world? And it needs to be big enough for you to get excited and scared and have to work for it. It's supposed to be like finding your moment or passion, what really matters to you. And if you don't know exactly what it is, you pick a quadrant. It could be human rights, it could be women's rights, it could be the environment. You pick a space. And the reason this is important is these problems require cooperation. And you really need to be involved in hard problems for cooperation. Now,
Yeah.
why? Well, maybe not when you're trying to pay off your student loans. Okay, I get that. But there's a point in your life where you want to have something really meaningful to continue to drive, to go through the hard times and to stay focused on making a difference. The next question after you've asked that is, what role do you want to play in that? So everybody's got different gifts and skills and desires. You've got marketing, you've got design engineering, you've got entrepreneurship, you've got analytics. There's all these skills. Where do you want to play? Where do you want to put yourself into the system? Now then, you know the classes to take. Now you know the companies to go after. Now you know what to look for and interview for when you're making these decisions for yourself. I've found that supply chain rules the world. There is not a problem out there that supply chain will not be involved in. So if you want to make a difference in the world, supply chain is how you insert yourself into that. Now then, can you do it some other ways? Yes. There's some other professions out there, but we're supply chain people here. So if you're not sure and you don't have an answer that pops out of your chest and you have to pay the bills, just get started. Start working in supply chain, pick a spot and start working. Go to the next spot, go to the next spot. You will run into a passion somewhere along the line, and all those skills that you learned in supply chain, even the ones that you maybe didn't want to have to deal with, right? Or maybe that job you really didn't want to do, you're going to look back and you're going to go, oh, I see how it fit. I see why it's important. And now that I can apply it. And now then you get your second wind and you hit your passion and you start running toward your passion goals. You'll look back and go, oh my goodness, I can't believe I did all of that.
Yeah.
That's basically what will happen.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Lisa. It was really fascinating. Really appreciate it. You joining us today. Can you please give us your contact information if anybody wants to contact you?
You can look me up on LinkedIn And it's Elisa Denver, D as in David, E-N, D as in David, E-R. To my knowledge, I'm the only one there, and I look like this. So you can send me a note through LinkedIn, and then I'll connect with you. Or come to Rosemary. Rosemary always knows how to find me, right?
That's right. All right. And you can listen to more Frictionless Supply Chain podcasts hosted on Supply Chain Management Review's landing page, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. And you can reach me, Rosemary Coates, at rcoates@reshoringinstitute.org, and visit our website, www.reshoringinstitute.org, where we publish all of our research on manufacturing in America. Have a great day, everyone.